in the mist-shrouded fjords of ancient Scandinavia, where the water meets the sky in an endless embrace of blue and gray. The Vikings prepared their dead for the greatest journey of all, the journey beyond the veil of this world into the mysterious realms that waited beyond. These seafaring people, who lived their lives guided by the rhythm of the waves and the call of distant shores, understood death not as an ending, but as a transition, a peaceful passage from one world to another. And what better vessel for this final voyage than the very ships that had carried them through life? Picture, if you will, the gentle lapping of waves against a wooden hull, the soft creak of timber as the tide slowly rises. A Viking burial ship rests on the shoreline, its graceful curves silhouetted against the fading light of day. The vessel has been carefully selected, sometimes a cherished ship that had served its owner faithfully through years of exploration and adventure. Other times, a ship built specially for this solemn purpose, crafted with the same care and attention to detail as any vessel meant for the living. Within the ship, a burial chamber has been prepared. Imagine the soft furs lining the space where the deceased will rest, the gentle placement of personal belongings all around. There is no hurry in these preparations, no rushed movements or harsh sounds. Each item is positioned with purpose, with meaning, with reverence for the one who has departed. Family members move quietly about their tasks, their whispers carried away by the coastal breeze. For the Vikings, these ship burials were reserved for those of important chieftains, wealthy merchants, noblewomen, respected warriors. The ship itself was not merely a container for the dead, but a symbol rich with meaning. It represented the vessel that would carry the departed soul across the cosmic waters to the afterlife, just as ships had carried the Vikings across earthly seas during their lifetime. As the sun begins its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long golden rays across the water, more preparations are made. The deceased is dressed in their finest clothes, garments perhaps sewn specifically for this occasion. During the days following their death, jewelry glints in the fading light, silver brooches, amber beads, perhaps a gold arm ring for a chieftain, or a set of delicate glass beads for a noblewoman dot around the body. Grave goods are arranged with careful precision. A sword may rest at a warrior's side, its blade catching the light. A seamstress might have her needles and threads, a woodworker his finest tools. Food and drink vessels are placed nearby, ensuring the departed will not hunger or thirst on their journey. Each object tells part of the story of a life lived, interests pursued, skills mastered, roles fulfilled. The Vikings believed items buried in the dead would accompany them to the afterlife. A chieftain would need his symbols of authority in the next world, a craftsperson their tools, a warrior their weapons. Even animals might be sacrificed to accompany their master's horses to ride in the afterlife. Dogs to hunt alongside them, sometimes birds of rare beauty, like the peacock found in the Gokstad burial, perhaps symbols of exotic connections and worldly status. As night falls gently over the scene, family members gather around the ship. There is quiet singing, perhaps, soft chanting that rises and falls like the waves themselves. Stories might be told of the deceased, tales of courage, of kindness, of notable deeds, both large and small. Mead or ale would be shared, a final toast to honor the departed before their journey begins. In some traditions, the ship would be pushed out to sea, perhaps set aflame as it drifted toward the horizon, a spectacle of fire upon water, light against the gathering darkness. More commonly, however, the vessel would remain on land, covered gradually by a mound of earth that would stand as a monument for generations to come. A gentle rise in the landscape, marking the resting place of the honored dead. These mounds became part of the geography of memory. Imagine walking along a coastline centuries ago, the grassy knolls rising from the landscape, each one a story, each one a life remembered. The Vikings passed these mounds in their daily travels, remembered the names of those who rested within, and told tales of their deeds. In this way, the dead remained part of the community of the living, their memory preserved in the very land itself. In places like Vestfold in Norway, these burial mounds dotted the landscape, some small and humble, others large and imposing. The largest ship burials, like those found at Oseberg and Gokstad, would have required tremendous effort from the community, a final act of respect and honor for the deceased. The mounds protected the ships and their precious contents, creating a sealed environment that, in some fortunate cases, preserved these treasures for over 1,000 years, allowing us a window into this solemn practice. The burial mounds served another purpose, too. They were visible markers of territory, of inheritance, of belonging. They said to all who passed, "Here lie our ancestors. Here is our claim to this land. Here is the physical embodiment of our lineage and our history." The dead remained, in a sense, guardians of the land they had once walked upon in life. As we drift with these thoughts, imagine the passage of seasons over these burial mounds. Spring brings tender green shoots pushing through the earth. Summer cloaks the mounds in wildflowers and tall grasses that wave gently in the breeze. Autumn dusts them with fallen leaves in russet and gold, and winter covers them with a blanket of pristine snow. Through it all, the ships remain below, timeless vessels, now sailing only in memory and imagination, carrying their precious cargo through the centuries. And so the Viking dead rested, not in fear or darkness, but embraced by the symbols of their culture, the ships that had defined their way of life, the tools that had shaped their days, the treasures that had measured their success. They waited in these earth-covered ships, these quiet vessels of eternity, for whatever adventures might await them in the worlds beyond this one. Let us journey now to a particular ship burial, perhaps the most remarkable ever discovered, the Oseberg ship burial in Norway. The year was 834 CE, and 2 women of great importance had died. Their identities remain a mystery that has tantalized archaeologists and historians for generations. But the splendor of their burial speaks volumes about their status and the society that honored them so elaborately. Picture a summer's day over 1,000 years ago, the air fragrant with pine and salt from the nearby a magnificent ship, its wooden planks still smelling of fresh oil and tar, is drawn up onto the shore. This vessel is no ordinary craft, is a masterpiece of Viking shipbuilding, its prow rising in an elegant curve adorned with intricate carvings, its 90-foot length impressive against the landscape. The ship had been built around 820 CE in western Norway, crafted from oak with a deck and mast of pine. A seaworthy vessel, that had likely sailed the waters of the North Sea before being chosen for this solemn purpose. The community has gathered to lay to women to rest, one elderly, perhaps around 80 years of age, the other younger, about 50. Who were they? Perhaps a queen and her servant, or a priestess and her attendant, or even a mother and daughter of noble lineage. Their identities remain veiled in the mists of time, but the care taken in their burial suggests women of extraordinary standing. In a society often remembered primarily for its male warriors and explorers, within the ship, just behind the mast, a burial chamber is constructed, a wooden house of death that will shelter the women in their final rest. Inside, a bed is prepared, with large down quilts of remarkable softness. The women are dressed in their finest garments, the fabrics rich in color and texture, adorned perhaps with embroidery or tablet-woven bands of intricate patterns. Their jewelry catches the light, perhaps amber beads, silver brooches, rings of twisted gold. Their hair is combed and arranged with care, their bodies positioned with dignity upon the bed they will share in death. Around them, the burial chamber fills with treasures. There are personal items, clothes for different seasons and occasions, leather shoes crafted with care, combs made of antler for their hair. There are exotic vessels from distant lands, Ireland or England, testament to the far-reaching connections of these Norse people. The women are surrounded by the accoutrements of daily life, kitchen equipment, farm tools, everything they might need in the afterlife. But it is outside the burial chamber, arranged throughout the ship, that the truly extraordinary grave goods are placed. Imagine the wonder of it: 3 ornately carved sleighs, their wooden surfaces covered with intricate animal interlace patterns, fantastic beasts coiling and uncoiling across the wood. A work sleigh joins them, plainer but equally well-crafted. There is a wagon, too, the only complete Viking age cart ever found, its wooden body decorated with elaborate carvings of mythological scenes. 5 carved animal heads, masterpieces of Viking art, are placed within the ship. Their exact purpose remains uncertain. Were they prow ornaments for ceremonial vessels, or staff carried in religious processions? Whatever their function, they represent the pinnacle of Norse wood carving, their surfaces alive with knotwork patterns and stylized features. More practical items join this assemblage: extra beds, tents for travel, various tools and implements needed for a comfortable existence. And then there are the animals, sacrificed to accompany their mistresses into the afterlife. 15 horses, their bodies arranged with care. 6 dogs, faithful companions even in death, and 2 cows to provide sustenance in the world beyond. Most remarkable of all, perhaps, is a magnificent tapestry placed in the burial chamber. This textile treasure, though fragmented when discovered centuries later, depicts processions of people and horses, wagons, and mysterious figures that may represent scenes from Norse mythology, or perhaps rituals associated with the goddess Freya. The woman who created this remarkable fabric was one of them among the dead, possessed extraordinary skill, their fingers working the threads to create images that would speak across the centuries. As the burial ritual continues, the ship and its precious cargo are covered, not with fire, as popular imagination might suggest, but with layers of blue clay, then carefully constructed layers of turf cut from the surrounding landscape. These materials create an airtight seal over the vessel and its contents, a protective embrace that will preserve these treasures in remarkable condition for over 1,000 years. The burial mound rises gradually over the ship 44 meters in diameter and perhaps originally 6 meters high, a significant landmark in the landscape. As the community completes this labor of respect and remembrance, they may gather for a funeral feast, sharing food and drink, telling stories of the women now beginning their journey to the afterlife. There might be songs, poetry recited from memory, perhaps rituals we can only guess at now, 1,000 years removed from their beliefs and practices. And then life continues. Seasons turn, years pass, generations come and go. The mound became a familiar feature of the landscape near what is now Tønsberg in Vestfold, Norway. People pass it in their daily travels, perhaps leaving small offerings on occasion, remembering the names of those buried within, until eventually, as Christianity replaces the old ways, the identities of the women are forgotten, though the mound itself remains. Centuries passed in gentle silence until 1904, when the farmer who owned the land noticed unusual depressions in the ancient mound. Excavations revealed one of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries ever made: the Oseberg ship burial. Its contents preserved in remarkable condition thanks to the protective blue clay and turf covering. The ship was recovered, along with hundreds of artifacts that offer us a window into Viking Age life and death. Today, the ship and many of its treasures are displayed in the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo, allowing visitors to wonder at the craftsmanship and beauty of these objects. The sleighs, with their fantastic animal carvings, the wagon with its elaborate decoration, the animal headposts with their mysterious purposal, speak of a rich culture that honored its elite. Women with spectacular grave goods and elaborate rituals. The women themselves have also been studied, their bones revealing some of their story. The older woman suffered from advanced osteoporosis and possibly cancer, conditions that would have caused her significant pain in her final years. The younger woman's remains show no obvious cause of death. Were they related by blood or social standing? Did one serve the other, or were they equals in status? These questions continue to intrigue researchers. What is clear, however, is that these women were honored in death with one of the most spectacular burials ever discovered from the Viking Age. The care taken with their funeral arrangements, the quality and quantity of grave goods provided for their journey to the next world, all speak of individuals of tremendous importance to their community. In a society often remembered for its male warriors, the Oseberg burial reminds us that Viking women could also hold positions of great power, prestige, and respect. As the light fades and darkness settles over our thoughts, let us leave the queens of Oseberg to their rest, their ship now safely harbored, not beneath a mound of earth, but in the protective space of a museum. Their story continuing to unfold as researchers learn more about these remarkable women and the extraordinary burial that has preserved their memory across more than a millennium. As the gentle tide of our journey continues, let us drift to another remarkable ship burial discovered in Norway, the Gokstad ship. Unlike the Oseberg burial with its 2 female occupants, the Gokstad burial contained a single male of significant stature, both literally and figuratively. His was a story written not in historical records that have survived to our time, but in the bones and artifacts that remained sealed beneath the earth for centuries. Imagine a cool autumn day in the late 9th century, perhaps around 890 CE, in what is now Vestfold, Norway. The community has gathered to lay to rest a man of importance, a chieftain or local leader, whose influence extended across the surrounding lands. He was tall for his time, standing between 181 and 183 centimeters, about 5 feet 11 to 6 feet, with a powerful build that speaks of a life of physical activity. At around 40 to 50, he had lived a full life by the standards of his era. The ship selected for his burial is magnificent, a vessel built for both seaworthiness and speed, capable of carrying approximately 32 oarsmen. Unlike the more ornately decorated Oseberg ship, the Gokstad ship represents the pinnacle of practical Viking shipbuilding, a craft that could have sailed open seas and navigated rivers with equal facility. Its oak planks overlap in the distinctive clinker-built style that gave Viking ships their characteristic flexibility and strength. That day, however, the ship was drawn ashore for its final purpose. It rests on the land that will become its eternal birth, its sailing days now finished. Within the vessel, a burial chamber has been constructed just aft of the mast, a wooden room built specifically to house the body of the chieftain and some of his grave goods. The man himself has been carefully prepared. His body has been washed, his hair and beard combed and arranged. He is dressed in clothing befitting his status, though no finery of gold or silver accompanies him. These may have been removed by grave robbers in later centuries, or perhaps, for reasons we cannot know, were never included in the burial. What is curious about this burial is the absence of weapons. For Viking men of status, weapons were typically essential grave goods, symbols of their role as protectors and warriors. Yet the Gokstad man goes to his grave without sword, spear, or axe. Was this a deliberate choice, perhaps reflecting his primary role as a trader or civic leader rather than a warrior? Or were these items later removed by those who opened the mound? The answer remains elusive, another mystery from this distant time. What does accompany the chieftain, however, are items related to transportation and practical life. 3 small boats are included in the burial, perhaps symbolizing the importance of water transportation in all aspects of Viking life. Tent is carefully folded and placed within the ship. Did it represent shelter for journeys in this world and the next? A sledge for winter travel joins the assemblage, along with riding equipment that speaks of travel by horse and by sea. Animals, too, are sacrificed to accompany their master. The bones of 12 horses are arranged around the burial chamber, faithful steeds to carry the chieftain in the afterlife. 6 dogs, perhaps hunting companions or loyal guardians, are positioned nearby. Most surprisingly, the remains of a peacock were discovered, an exotic bird that would have been rare and precious in Viking Age Norway. Perhaps a symbol of far-reaching trade connections or unusual wealth. As the community completes the grave arrangements, they begin the process of sealing the burial. The ship and its contents are covered completely with clay and turf, creating a mound that rises approximately 5 meters above the surrounding landscape, a permanent marker of the chieftain's resting place. This mound, known locally as Gokstadhaugen or King's Mound, would stand as a monument to the man buried within it for the next 1,000 years. Life continues around the burial site. Generations pass, Christianity gradually replaces the Old Norse. Religion and the identity of the man in the mound fades from memory. The mound itself remains a feature of the landscape, however, its presence a constant reminder of an earlier age. In the winter of 1879 to 1880, local farmers discovered the mound contained more than earth. While digging into the side of the mound, they uncovered wooden objects that prompted a professional archaeological excavation in the spring of 1880. What emerged from the soil was the Gokstad ship, remarkably well preserved after nearly a millennium. Underground, the excavation revealed not only the ship itself, but the burial chamber with the chieftain's remains and the various grave goods that had accompanied him. Unfortunately, there were signs that the burial had been disturbed, likely during the Viking Age itself. A hole had been cut through the ship's roof above the burial chamber, suggesting that grave robbers had entered the mound at some point after the burial, perhaps taking any gold, silver, or weapons that may have been originally included. Despite this disturbance, the discovery of the Gokstad ship was a significant archaeological achievement. The ship itself was in remarkably good condition, providing valuable insights into Viking shipbuilding techniques. The vessel's design has inspired numerous replicas in modern times, demonstrating the seaworthiness of these ancient craft. One such replica, the Viking, sailed across the Atlantic Ocean from Norway to America in 1893, proving that Viking ships were indeed capable of the long-distance voyages described in the sagas. But who was this man, this chieftain of Gokstad? In the 1920s, the archaeologist Anton Willem Brigger suggested he might be Olaf Geirstadolf, a king of the Yngling dynasty mentioned in Norse sagas. However, this identification remains speculative, not proven by any definitive evidence. The chieftain's identity, like that of the Oseberg women, remains a mystery. His name lost to time even as his physical remains and possessions have survived. What we can know of him comes from his bones, which tell the story of a man who suffered greatly at the end of his life. Analysis of his skeleton revealed cuts to both legs around the knees, likely from battle wounds. These injuries had become infected, and the infection had spread to the bone, causing significant pain in his final days or weeks. Perhaps it was these wounds and the resulting infection that ultimately caused his death. As the light of our story begins to fade on the chieftain of Gokstad, we are left with an impression of a powerful man, physically imposing, someone who had accumulated enough status and wealth to merit a ship burial of considerable grandeur. Yet he remains a shadow figure, his specific deeds and accomplishments unknown to us. What battles did he fight? What journeys did he undertake? What role did he play in his community? These questions have no answers now, lost in the mists of time. The Gokstad ship and many of the artifacts recovered from it now reside in the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo, not far from the Oseberg ship and its treasures. There, visitors can stand before these remarkable vessels and contemplate the lives of those who were laid to rest within them over 1,000 years ago, the queens of Oseberg and the chieftain of Gokstad, their final voyages now long complete, their stories still unfolding through ongoing research and our continuing fascination with the Viking Age and its burial customs. As our journey through Viking burial customs continues, let us turn our attention to a different type of ship burial, one where no wooden vessel was interred, but where the symbolic power of the ship remained central to the funerary tradition. We travel now to Lindholm Huge, near present-day Aalborg, in Denmark, where hundreds of graves, marked by stone ship settings, create a hauntingly beautiful cemetery beneath the open sky. Picture a gently rolling landscape overlooking the Limfjord. In northern Denmark, for hundreds of years, from approximately 400 to 1000 CE, spanning both the Germanic Iron Age and the Viking Age, this site served as a burial ground for the local community. Over time, nearly 700 graves accumulated on the slope, with approximately 150 of them marked by stones, arranged in the distinctive shape of a ship. Unlike the elaborate ship burials at Oseberg and Gokstad, where actual wooden vessels were used, these stone ship settings were symbolic representations, outlines created with carefully placed boulders that evoked the shape of a ship without the enormous expense of sacrificing an actual vessel. Some of these stone ships are quite small, merely 1 to 2 meters in length, while others stretch longer across the hillside, their stone hulls embracing the remains of the deceased. Imagine walking among these stone vessels on a quiet morning, mist rising from the fjord below, the only sounds the calling of birds and the gentle rustling of grasses in the breeze. Each stone ship contains a story, life lived, a death mourned, a journey to the afterlife symbolically embarked upon. Most of the burials at Lindholm Huge were cremations, the ashes of the dead perhaps placed in urns or simply scattered within. The outline of stones, the stone ships point in different directions, some north-south, others east-west, suggesting they may have been aligned according to the season of death, or perhaps other factors important in Norse cosmology. Many are arranged in clusters, perhaps representing family groups who wished to remain together even in death. Some ships overlap slightly, a testament to the long-term use of this burial ground, and the desire to place new graves near those of ancestors or relatives. In addition to the ship-shaped arrangements, other graves at Lindholm Huge are marked by stones placed in triangular or circular patterns. These different shapes may have indicated various social roles, genders, or other distinctions important to the community, but whose exact meanings are now lost to us. The variety of patterns creates a complex tapestry of stone across the hillside. Each arrangement a deliberate choice made by mourners centuries ago. Using stones to mark graves was practical and symbolic. Stone is permanent, enduring through the seasons and years when wooden markers would decay. The stones also prevented burial by animals or natural processes. But beyond these practical considerations, the stone ship carried profound meaning for the Norse people. For a seafaring culture like the Vikings, the ship represented not just a means of transportation, but a connection between worlds. In life, ships carried people across water to new lands and opportunities. In symbolic terms, they could carry the soul across the cosmic waters to the afterlife realms by placing their dead within the outline of a ship. Whether a physical wooden vessel or a stone representation, the community provided the deceased with transportation for their final journey. The burials at Lindholm Huge contained grave goods as well, though generally more modest than those found in the grand ship burials of Norway. Personal items, everyday tools, and occasionally jewelry or weapons accompanied the cremated remains. providing the dead with necessities for their new existence. Some graves contained imported items from distant lands, evidence of the trade networks that connected even this relatively small community to the wider world. What makes Lindholm huge, particularly remarkable, is not just the cemetery itself, but its preservation. Around 1000 CE, sand from nearby dunes began to drift over the burial ground, gradually covering the entire site under a protective layer of fine particles. This natural phenomenon effectively sealed the cemetery, preserving the stone arrangements in their original positions and protecting them from later disturbance. For centuries, the burial ground remained hidden beneath the sand, forgotten by the local population as Christianity replaced the old Norse religion and new burial customs were adopted. It wasn't until the 1950s that archaeological excavations uncovered the full extent of the cemetery, revealing not just the graves, but also evidence of a nearby settlement where the community that created these burials once lived. The excavations at Lindholm Huge provided valuable insights into daily life during the Viking Age. The remains of longhouses, workshops, and other structures emerged from the protective sand, along with tools, kitchen implements, and other everyday items. This combination of settlement and cemetery gives us a more complete picture of a Viking community, the spaces where they lived their lives, and the place where they honored their dead. Today, Lindholm Huge is preserved as an archaeological site, open to visitors. The stone ship settings and other grave markers remain in their original positions, creating a landscape of memory on the hillside. A museum nearby houses artifacts found during the excavations and provides context for understanding this remarkable place. As you walk among the stone ships of Lindholm Huge, whether physically or in your imagination, consider the continuity represented by this burial ground. For approximately 600 years, generation after generation returned to this hillside to lay their dead to rest, marking their graves with enduring stone, creating a community of ancestors that mirrored the community of the living in the settlement below. The stones themselves tell a story of changing customs over time. The earlier burials from the Germanic Iron Age tend to be marked with circular or triangular stone settings, while the ship shape became more predominant during the Viking Age proper. This shift reflects evolving religious beliefs and burial practices, a community adapting its traditions while maintaining the core concept of providing for the dead. Each stone was placed with purpose, with meaning, by hands now long turned to dust themselves. Each grave represented not just a disposal of the dead, but an honoring of their memory, a recognition of their continuing spiritual presence, and a providing for their needs in whatever afterlife realm awaited them as the sun begins to set over Lindholm Huge. In our imagination, the lengthening shadows make the stone ships seem to rise slightly from the earth, as if preparing to sail on an evening tide. The boundary between this world and the next feels somehow thinner in such places, where generations of humans have marked the passage of their loved ones with such care and intention. In the stone ships of Lindholm Huge, we see a different expression of the same fundamental belief that animated the more famous ship burials, the conviction that death was a journey requiring proper transportation. Whether through the grandeur of an actual ship burial or the simpler symbolism of stones arranged on a hillside, The Norse people provided their dead with vessels for the crossing, a final act of care for those embarking on the greatest voyage of all. Among the most valuable sources we have for understanding Viking burial customs comes not from archaeology, but from a written eyewitness account in the early 10th century. A diplomat and scholar from Baghdad named Ahmad ibn Fadlan traveled north as part of an embassy to the Volga Bulgars. During his journey, he encountered a group of Rus traders, Scandinavian Vikings, who had traveled east along the river Rites and witnessed a funeral that he recorded in remarkable detail. His account provides us with a rare contemporaneous description of Viking funeral practices, offering insights that archaeology alone cannot provide. Imagine yourself beside Ibn Fadlan on the banks of the Volga River, a stranger in a strange land, observing customs both fascinating and, to his Muslim sensibilities, often disturbing. The year is approximately 922 CE, and a prominent Rus chieftain has died. What follows is a complex funeral ritual that unfolds over several days, each element carefully prescribed by tradition. Ibn Fadlan tells us that when the chieftain first died, his body was placed in a temporary grave with a roof built over it. For 10 days, while funeral preparations were made, the body remained in this intermediary state, not yet embarked on its final journey, but no longer fully part of the world of the living. During this time, the dead man's possessions were divided into 3 portions: 1/3 for his family, 1/3 to pay for the funeral clothes, and 1/3 to purchase an intoxicating drink for the ceremony to come. With quiet attention to detail, Ibn Fadlan describes how on the day of the funeral, the ship that would serve as the chieftain's final resting place was drawn up onto the riverbank. 4 corner posts of birch and other woods were erected, and around them wooden figures resembling tall posts were arranged. A couch was placed in the middle of the ship and covered with Byzantine brocade bedding and cushions. The next part of Ibn Fadlan's account describes the removal of the chieftain from his temporary grave. The body was dressed in specially prepared funeral clothes, trousers, leggings, boots, a tunic, and a kaftan of Byzantine brocade with gold buttons. A hat of the same brocade and sable was placed on his head. The dressed body was then carried to the pavilion on the ship and positioned on the couch with cushions propped around it. Various foods and drinks were placed around the body: bread, meat, onions, and nabid, an alcoholic drink. A dog was killed, cut in 2, and thrown onto the ship. 2 horses were ridden until they sweated, then cut to pieces with swords and thrown onto the ship. 2 cows, a rooster, and a hen received the same treatment. All this was done, Ibn Fadlan was told, so that these animals would serve the dead man in the afterlife. One of the most controversial aspects of Ibn Fadlan's account involves the treatment of a female slave who had volunteered to die with her master. For our peaceful narrative, we'll soften this element while acknowledging its historical reality. The woman was present for several days before the final ceremony, drinking and singing daily. On the day of the funeral, she was led through a symbolic frame repeatedly raised by the men, each time declaring she could see into the afterlife, first her deceased parents, then other dead relatives, and finally her master in paradise. Calling to her, after various ritual preparations, the woman was taken to the ship, where, following certain ceremonies, too dark for our gentle tale, Her life was ended so she might accompany her master to the afterlife. While disturbing to modern sensibilities, this practice reflected a belief that the chieftain would need companions and servants in the next world, just as he had required them in this one. The final act of the funeral involved the lighting of the funeral pyre. The closest male relative of the deceased, naked except for a loincloth, walked backward toward the ship with a torch, shielding his face as he ignited the wood prepared beneath the vessel. Other participants then added more wood and tinder until the flames engulfed the ship and everything on it. Ibn Fadlan notes that a strong wind arose, intensifying the flames. Within an hour, the ship and all its contents were reduced to ashes. The Rus then built a round mound over the site where the ship had been and placed a wooden post in the center, inscribed with the names of the dead chieftain and the king of the Rus. Then they departed. This account, though describing practices among the Eastern Rus rather than in Scandinavia proper, offers valuable insights into Viking funerary beliefs. The careful preparation of the body, the inclusion of grave goods, the sacrifice of animals, the use of a ship as the funeral vessel, and the raising of a mound afterward all align with archaeological evidence found throughout the Viking world. What makes Ibn Fadlan's account particularly valuable is that it describes the ritual actions and their stated purposes. The animals were sacrificed so they could serve the dead man in paradise. The ship was burned to send the deceased swiftly to the afterlife. These explanations give us glimpses into the beliefs that underlay the physical practices, the spiritual understanding that gave meaning to these elaborate rituals. Ibn Fadlan's perspective as an outside observer is both a limitation and a strength. As a Muslim from a very different culture, he viewed many Rus practices with disapproval and sometimes disgust, particularly their hygiene habits and sexual customs. This cultural bias colors his account. However, precisely because he found these customs so strange, he described them in greater detail than someone familiar with the practices might have done, providing valuable ethnographic information that would otherwise be lost to us. The account also reveals aspects of Viking funeral practices that archaeology alone cannot show us. The temporary burial, the division of property, the ceremonial raising of the slave woman, the ritual lighting of the pyre, the inscribed memorial post. These elements leave little or no archaeological trace, but were significant components of the funeral ritual. As we reflect on Ibn Fadlan's account, we should remember that it describes one specific funeral among one group of Rus traders on the Volga River. It cannot be taken as representative of all Viking funerals throughout Scandinavia over the 3 centuries of the Viking Age. Burial practices varied widely across time and space, influenced by local traditions, social status, available resources, and gradually the encroachment of Christianity. Nevertheless, this rare eyewitness account offers us a window into a world otherwise accessible only through archaeology and later literary sources. It allows us to imagine, however imperfectly, the sights, sounds, and activities of a Viking funeral as it unfolded. The ship drawn up on the riverbank, the body dressed in finery, the animals sacrificed, the flames consuming the vessel, the mound rising over the ashes. As Ibn Fadlan concluded his observations and continued his journey, the memory of what he had witnessed traveled with him, eventually to be written down and preserved for future generations. His account, filtered through his cultural perspective and the limitations of translation, nonetheless carries echoes of voices long silenced, of beliefs long forgotten, of rituals once performed with absolute conviction in their efficacy and meaning in the quiet hours of night. As we contemplate this ancient witness and his remarkable account, we might imagine the ship ablaze on the riverbank, flames reaching toward the stars, smoke carrying the soul of the chieftain upward. Whatever our own beliefs about death and what follows, we can recognize in this elaborate ritual the universal human desire to honor the dead, to ease their passage to whatever awaits, and to maintain some connection across the ultimate boundary that separates the living from those who have gone before. In the gentle twilight between wakefulness and dreams, let us explore the beliefs that gave meaning to the elaborate burial customs of the Norse people. For the Vikings, death was not an end, but a transition, a passage from one state of being to another. Their understanding of what followed death was complex and multifaceted, lacking the systematic theology that would later characterize Christian beliefs about the afterlife. Picture a Norse family gathered around a hearth on a winter's evening, firelight casting flickering shadows on the walls of their wooden dwelling. Perhaps an elder speaks of what awaits beyond death, stories passed down through generations, beliefs held not as dogma but as traditions, as possibilities, as the wisdom of ancestors. In these stories, we find not one afterlife, but many, not a single destination, but multiple realms that might receive the souls of the departed. Most famous of these afterlife realms is Valhalla, the Hall of the Fallen, where the god Odin gathered warriors slain in battle. Imagine this great hall with its roof thatched with golden shields, its rafters formed from spears. Here the chosen warriors, the Einherjar, spend their days in combat training, fighting and falling only to rise again for the evening feast. They dine on the meat of the magical boar, Hrimnir, who is slaughtered each day only to be restored to life the next morning, and drink mead served by the Valkyries, the choosers of the slain, who had escorted them to Valhalla in the first place. This afterlife was not one of peaceful rest, but of continued activity, of preparation for Ragnarok, the final battle at the end of time, when these warriors would fight alongside Odin against the forces of chaos and destruction. It was a warrior's paradise, reflecting the values of a society where combat skill was highly prized and a good death in battle was considered honorable. But Valhalla was not the only possibility. The goddess Freya, too, received the dead in her hall called Folkvanger, the field of the people, or the field of warriors. According to the prose Edda, Freya chose half of those who died in battle, with Odin receiving the other half. The precise criteria for this division remain unclear in the sources that survive, but it suggests that even within the category of battle slain, different afterlife destinations were possible. For those who died at sea, a common fate in a seafaring culture, the realm of the goddess Ran might be their destination. Imagine the underwater hall of this giantess, a submerged mead hall where the drowned might feast and carouse much as they had in life. Ra was said to catch sailors in her net, drawing them down to her domain beneath the waves. Most Norse people, however, were destined for Hel, a realm beneath the ground, ruled by a goddess of the same name. Unlike the Christian concept of hell, that would later replace it in Scandinavia. The Norse hell was not a place of punishment for moral failings. It was simply where most of the dead went. Regardless of how they had lived their lives, hell was imagined as a misty, shadowy realm, neither particularly pleasant nor actively torturous. The dead there continued a kind of existence that mirrored their life on earth. They ate, drank, fought, slept, and engaged in the same activities they had enjoyed while alive. The quality of this afterlife might depend on the quality of their burial and the continued remembrance of their living descendants rather than on any moral judgment of their earthly behavior. In addition to these mythological realms, there was a strong belief that the dead might remain in or near their burial mounds, maintaining a connection to the land and to their descendants. In some areas, it was thought that mountains or hills housed communities of the dead, entire ancestor groups dwelling together within the earth. These local beliefs created a landscape populated not just by the living, but by generations of ancestors. Their presence felt in the natural features of the environment. Some Viking graves have been found that suggest a belief in rebirth or reincarnation within the family line. Objects that seem to bridge generations are looms passed down through family lines, or items that connect to ancestors, hint at a concept of the soul or some essence of the person returning in successive generations. The Old Norse word, hamingja, often translated as luck or fortune, seems at times to refer to a kind of inheritable spiritual quality that could be passed from one generation to the next. The Norse conception of the self was itself complex and multifaceted. They did not view a person as having a single unified soul, but rather several spiritual aspects that might have different fates after death. The Hugr mind thought hammer shape or form that could sometimes be separated from the physical. Body Fylgja, a kind of guardian spirit or fetch, and hamingja, luck or fortune, were all components of the self that might continue in various ways after death. This multiplicity of afterlife beliefs was reflected in the variety of burial practices throughout the Viking world. Ship burials, with their suggestion of a voyage to another realm, aligned with the idea of traveling to Valhalla or another mythological destination. Cremation might have been seen as releasing the spirit more quickly from the body. Inhumation, with grave goods, furnished the dead with items needed for their continued existence in hell or within the burial mound itself. The inclusion of animals in burials, horses, dogs, birds, and occasionally other creatures, suggests a belief that these companions would be needed or desired in the afterlife. Similarly, the tools, weapons, and personal items buried with the dead indicate an expectation that the next life would involve activities similar to those of this world. As Christianity gradually spread through the Norse lands from the 10th century onward, these varied afterlife beliefs began to be replaced by the Christian concepts of heaven, hell, and purgatory. The transition was not always smooth or clear-cut. Archaeological evidence shows hybrid burial practices that combined elements of both traditions, suggesting a period where old and new beliefs coexisted or merged by the end of the Viking Age. Around 1066 CE, Christianity had become the dominant religion throughout Scandinavia, though pockets of traditional belief likely persisted in remote areas for some time afterward. The elaborate ship burials, the cremation rituals, The equipping of the dead with weapons and tools, these practices gradually faded away, replaced by Christian burial in consecrated ground with minimal grave goods. What remained, however, was the fundamental human desire to make sense of death, to create meaningful rituals around this universal transition, and to maintain some connection with those who had gone before. The specific forms changed, but the underlying needs they addressed continued. As we drift between these ancient beliefs, these pathways to the beyond imagined by the Norse people, we might reflect on how their varied afterlife concepts provided comfort and meaning in the face of death's mystery. Whether bound for Valhalla's golden hall, Freya's field, Arna's underwater realm, the shadowy expanses of hell, or the continued existence within burial mounds and mountains, the dead remained part of the community, their journey continuing beyond the threshold we all must someday cross in the quiet depth of night. As sleep begins to embrace us, like the earth embracing a burial ship, we might imagine these ancient souls on their varied journeys, warriors feasting in Valhalla, ancestors dwelling in their mounds, spirits traveling the cosmic waterways in ships of wood or stone. Their beliefs, though distant from our own time, speak to the enduring human quest to find meaning in mortality, to create continuity beyond the boundary of death, and to honor those whose lives have shaped our own. As we continue our gentle journey through Viking burial traditions, let us turn our attention to the smaller, more personal items that often accompanied the Norse people in death: the amulets, symbols, and protective objects that were believed to guard the deceased on their journey to the afterlife and in whatever realm awaited them. Beyond, imagine a craftsperson's workshop in a Viking settlement, perhaps lit by the warm glow of an oil lamp or the flickering light of a hearth fire. Here, skilled hands work metal, bone, amber, and wood into objects of both beauty and spiritual significance. These are not merely decorative pieces, but items infused with meaning, with protective powers, with connections to the gods and the cosmic forces that shaped the Norse understanding of the world. Perhaps the most recognizable and widespread protective symbol in the Viking world was Mjolnir, Thor's hammer. Small pendants shaped like this mythical weapon have been found throughout Scandinavia and in Viking settlements abroad, crafted from various materials, but most commonly from silver. These hammer amulets ranged from simple, stylized forms to elaborate pieces decorated with filigree or twisted wire in life. Wearing Thor's hammer served as both a religious identifier and a protective talisman. Thor was the defender of both gods and humans against the forces of chaos, particularly the Gitner giants. His hammer, Mjolnir, was the instrument of this protection, a weapon that always returned to his hand when thrown, and that could shrink to a size small enough to be hidden under his clothing. By wearing a representation of this divine tool, a person sought Thor's protection against harm, illness, and malevolent spiritual forces in death. These hammer amulets continued their protective function. Placed in graves or worn by the deceased, they provided divine safeguarding for the soul's journey and continued existence. They may have been especially significant in the later Viking Age, when Christianity was beginning to make inroads into Norse territories. Some scholars suggest that wearing Thor's hammer became a deliberate expression of adherence to the old ways, a statement of religious identity in a changing spiritual landscape. Archaeological findings support this theory. Hammer amulets became more common in the 10th and early 11th centuries, precisely when Christian influence was growing in Scandinavia. In some cases, hybrid forms have been found that combine elements of both the hammer and the Christian cross, perhaps reflecting individuals or communities caught between the two belief systems. Beyond Thor's hammer, other symbols associated with specific gods might accompany the dead. Miniature spears represented Odin, the god of warfare, wisdom, and death. Small figures of seated women might connect to Freya or Frigg, goddesses associated with fertility, love, and domestic affairs. Bronze or silver figures of birds could reference Odin's ravens, Hugin and Munin, who flew throughout the world gathering information for the one-eyed god. Another protective symbol found in burials is the Våknad, a design of 3 interlocked triangles whose precise meaning remains somewhat mysterious. The name Våknad is modern rather than Old Norse, meaning not of the slain, and the symbol appears on several runstones associated with death, and on objects found in burials. Its connection to Odin and to death seems clear, but its exact significance, whether it marked someone chosen by Odin for Valhalla, served as a protective emblem, or had some other meaning, remains a subject of scholarly debate. Runic inscriptions provided another form of spiritual protection for the dead. The Norse runic alphabet, or Futhark, was believed to have magical and communicative properties. Certain runic combinations, called bindrunes, merged 2 or more runes into a single character, potentially amplifying their power. Objects inscribed with protective or commemorative runes have been found in graves throughout the Viking world. One example is the Kingmore ring, discovered in Cumbria, England, which bears a runic inscription interpreted as a protective charm against illness. Such inscribed objects placed in graves might have been intended to protect the deceased from harmful forces or to ensure their well-being in the afterlife. Amber, with its warm color and natural electrical properties, held special significance. In Norse culture, amber beads and amulets are common finds in Viking graves, particularly women's burials. This fossilized tree resin was associated with the goddess Freya, who was said to weep tears of gold and amber. Amber's ability to generate static electricity when rubbed may have seemed magical to the Norse, enhancing its perceived protective qualities. Animals played important roles in Norse mythology, and representations of them often served as protective symbols. Pendants and small figurines shaped like bears, wolves, boars, and horses have been found in burials. Each animal had its own associations. Bears and wolves connected to warrior cults and to Odin, boars to Freya and her brother Freyr, horses to fertility, and to Odin's 8-legged steed Sleipnir. Of particular significance were serpents and dragons, which appear frequently in Viking art. The great serpent, Jarmungandr, the Midgard serpent that encircled the world, was both a threatening figure in Norse cosmology and a symbol of the boundaries between ordered existence and chaos. Dragon-headed posts, like those found in the Oseberg ship burial, may have served protective functions, guarding against malevolent forces. Another common protective symbol was the Yggjálmur, or Helm of Aa, a circular design composed of 8 trident-like arms radiating from a center point. This symbol was believed to confer invincibility and to strike fear into enemies. while its use in the Viking Age isn't as well documented as some other symbols. Related designs appear on later Icelandic magical manuscripts and may have roots in earlier practices. For women's burials in particular, items related to household management and textile production often had symbolic and practical significance. Spindle whorls, weaving tools, and keys to household storage chests were symbols of a woman's authority and responsibility. The Norse goddess Frigg was associated with spinning, and the Norns' female beings who determined fate were depicted as spinning the threads of destiny. Thus, textile tools in burials might have connected the deceased woman to these divine feminine powers. Keys, too, had symbolic weight beyond their practical function. They represented not just access to material goods, but authority over the household, a significant role in a society where wealth was largely stored in portable valuables rather than land. A woman with keys at her belt or in her grave was marked as someone with status and responsibility. Some Viking graves contain items that seem chosen specifically for protective or magical purposes rather than everyday use. These might include unusual stones, animal teeth, or claws, small containers that may have held herbs or other materials with perceived magical properties, or objects made from rare or exotic materials. The placement of these protective objects within the grave was not random. Amulets might be worn by the deceased, just as they had been in life, or placed strategically within the burial near the head, hands, or heart, or at the boundaries of the grave. This careful positioning enhanced their efficacy in guarding the dead. As with other aspects of Viking burial customs, the use of protective symbols and amulets varied across time and space. Local traditions, family practices, and the gradual influence of Christianity all affected which symbols were used and how. By the end of the Viking Age, as Christian burial customs became dominant, many of these protective practices faded away or were absorbed into folk traditions that continued alongside official Christian observances today. Many of these ancient symbols have experienced a revival of interest, appearing in modern jewelry and art. While our understanding of their original meanings may be imperfect, they continue to fascinate us as windows into a worldview where the boundaries between the physical and spiritual realms were more permeable, where symbols carried power, and where both the living and the dead required protection on their respective journeys. As we drift toward sleep, we might imagine these small, potent objects resting in the earth alongside those they were meant to protect: Thor's hammers guarding warriors, amber beads gleaming beside noblewomen, runic inscriptions conveying their silent messages across the centuries. In their quiet presence, we glimpse a world where faith and magic intertwined, where simple objects could contain profound power, and where, even in death, one was not without protection. In the quiet depth of night, let us turn our thoughts to what remains long after the funeral feasts have ended. After the burial mounds have settled into the landscape, after the names of the dead have faded from memory, let us consider the bones, those most enduring parts of ourselves that can speak across centuries to those who know how to listen. Modern archaeology and bioarchaeology have given us tools to hear these silent witnesses, to extract from ancient remains details about lives lived long ago. From Viking burial sites throughout Scandinavia and the wider Norse world, Bones have been carefully excavated, studied, and in some cases, reunited with the stories of who these people might have been. Imagine a laboratory where a physical anthropologist gently examines a skull from a Viking burial, noting the shape of the eye orbits, the prominence of the brow ridge, the sutures between the cranial plates. These features can help determine the sex of the individual. One of the first questions asked when studying human remains. Male and female skulls have subtle but recognizable differences that trained eyes can discern. Other parts of the skeleton yield their own clues. The pelvis, with its distinctive shape differing between males and females due to the requirements of childbearing, provides perhaps the most reliable indicator of biological sex. Long bones, like the femur thigh bone, can be measured to estimate height. The general robustness of the skeleton, the size of muscle attachment points, and other features can suggest how physically active the person was in life. Age at death can be determined through various markers, the fusion of growth plates in younger individuals, the wear on teeth, the deterioration of joints, and changes to the pubic symphysis and other skeletal landmarks in adults. These estimates are not as precise as modern identification methods, but can usually place an individual within a reasonable age range. The bones from Viking burials tell us that these were generally robust people, often taller than their contemporaries in other parts of Europe. The men frequently show signs of healed injuries consistent with a warrior lifestyle, evidence of blade wounds, fractures from falls or blows, and occasionally injuries that proved fatal. Women's remains sometimes show signs of repetitive activities related to textile production, food preparation, and other domestic tasks that formed the backbone of Norse household economy. But not all roles were strictly divided by gender. Some female burials contain weapons and other items traditionally associated with male warriors, challenging our assumptions about gender roles in Viking society. The controversial Burka warrior, a high-status burial in Sweden, long assumed to be male because of its warrior grave goods, was revealed through DNA analysis to be biologically female, sparking scholarly debate about women's roles in Viking military activities. Teeth provide particularly rich information about diet, health, and geographic origins. Dental wear patterns can indicate the types of food consumed, with coarser diets containing more grit from stone ground flour, causing distinctive patterns of abrasion. Dental disease cavities, abscesses, periodontal issues, speaks to oral hygiene practices and the consumption of carbohydrates. In some Viking burials, teeth show filing marks that appear to be decorative modifications, perhaps indicating status or group identity. Modern isotope analysis of teeth can reveal where an individual grew up, as the chemical signature of local water becomes incorporated into developing teeth during childhood. This technique has identified Vikings buried far from their birthplaces, confirming the mobile nature of Viking society and the extensive networks that connected Norse communities across vast distances. Similarly, isotope analysis of bones can indicate dietary patterns, whether the person consumed mostly terrestrial or marine proteins. For instance, offering insights into subsistence practices and access to different food resources. Combined with archaeological evidence of food remains, these analyses help reconstruct the daily diet of Viking communities. Evidence of disease and trauma in Viking remains provides windows into the health challenges these people faced. Arthritis was common, particularly in the spine, shoulders, and knees, reflecting lives of physical labor. Healed fractures show that even serious injuries could be survived with the medical knowledge of the time. Some skeletons bear the marks of specific diseases affecting the spine. Leprosy altering the bones of the face and extremities, or syphilis causing characteristic changes to the skull. The woman from the Oseberg ship burial, for instance, suffered from advanced osteoporosis and possibly cancer, conditions that would have caused significant pain in her final years. The Gokstead chieftain had cuts around both knees that had become infected, likely leading to his death. These painful endings remind us that for all their cultural achievements and expansive activities, the Vikings were vulnerable to the same biological challenges that humans have always faced. Children's remains, when found in Viking burials, tell particularly poignant stories. Growth disruptions visible in their teeth or bones lines called Harris lines indicate periods of illness or malnutrition, severe enough to temporarily halt normal development. Not all children survived these challenges. Infant and childhood mortality was high, as it was throughout the pre-modern world. Some Viking burials contain individuals with congenital conditions or disabilities. These finds are particularly significant, as they demonstrate that Norse society made accommodations for those who could not participate in typical activities. A burial from Birka, Sweden, contained an individual with severe scoliosis who had nevertheless reached adulthood and been buried with care and appropriate grave goods, suggesting integration into the community despite physical differences. Occasionally, Viking burials reveal darker aspects of Norse society. At Trelleborg in Denmark, the bodies of two young people were found beneath the floor of a house, possibly foundation sacrifices meant to ensure the building's stability or good fortune. At Ridgeway Hill in England, a mass grave contained the remains of young Viking men who had been executed beheaded, with their heads stacked separately from their bodies, perhaps captured raiders who met a violent end. Yet most Viking burials, whether elaborate ship inhumations or simple cremations, show evidence of care and respect for the dead. Bodies were positioned deliberately, provided with appropriate grave goods, and placed in locations that would memorialize them within the community landscape. Even in death, these individuals remained part of the social fabric. Their physical remains a continuing presence in the world of the living. In recent years, advances in DNA analysis have added new dimensions to our understanding of the people. In Viking burials, genetic information can confirm biological relationships between individuals buried near each other, revealing family groupings and kinship structures. It can identify the geographic origins of people with greater precision than isotope analysis alone, and it can occasionally overturn long-held assumptions. As with the Birka warrior burial mentioned earlier, these scientific techniques, combined with traditional archaeological methods and historical sources, create increasingly detailed portraits of the people we call Vikings. We can now know not just how they died and were buried, but aspects of how they lived, what they ate, where they traveled, what physical challenges they faced, and how communities responded to diversity and difference among their members. As we contemplate these ancient bones in our minds, cleaned, measured, analyzed. But still fundamentally human, we might reflect on the commonality of experience that connects us across time. The Vikings' bodies, like our own, experienced growth and aging, injury and healing, the pleasures of movement and the pain of disease. They too knew hunger and satisfaction, exertion and rest, health and illness. Their bones, silent yet eloquent, remind us that beneath the cultural trappings of burial customs and religious beliefs lies our shared humanity, the universal experience of embodied existence and its inevitable conclusion. In studying their remains with respect and scientific care, we acknowledge both our differences from these ancient people and our fundamental kinship with them. As sleep begins to embrace us, we might imagine these bones resting in museum collections, or return to the earth after study, each one representing a life lived long ago, each one still telling its story to those who have learned to listen to this most enduring human testimony. As our exploration of Viking burial customs continues, let us turn our attention to the social aspects of death gatherings, feasts, and commemorative practices that help the living community process their grief, honor their dead, and re-establish social order after the loss of a member. Death in Viking society was not merely a private family matter, but an event that affected the entire community, requiring collective response and remembrance. Imagine the days following a death in a Viking settlement. The immediate family would begin preparations for the funeral, but they would not be alone in this work. Neighbors and community members would offer assistance, bringing food, helping to prepare the body, and constructing the burial site. This communal engagement reflected both practical necessity and social values, the understanding that grief is better borne when shared, and that honoring the dead properly required many hands. According to both archaeological evidence and later written sources like the sagas, funerals in Viking society were often accompanied by elaborate feasting. These gatherings served multiple purposes. They provided an opportunity for the community to share memories of the deceased, to express collective grief, and to honor the dead person's contributions to communal life. They also marked the transition of property and authority from the deceased to their heirs, publicly confirming the new social arrangements necessitated by death. The term arvel, or inheritance ale, described the funeral feast that traditionally took place after the burial. The name itself reveals one of its primary functions, the formal passing of inheritance. The heir or heirs would not fully assume their inherited property and status until this feast had been properly conducted, making it both a religious ritual and a legal procedure. Picture such a gathering in a large longhouse, the central hall of a prosperous farm, or the residence of a chieftain or jarl. Fires burn in the central hearth, providing warmth and light as community members fill the benches along the walls. Food is plentiful: meat, bread, cheese, perhaps fish, depending on the location. Ale and mead flow freely, passed in drinking horns or wooden cups from person to person. The feast begins with ritual elements. According to later sources, like the Heimskringla written several centuries after the Viking Age, but preserving older traditions, specific toasts would be drunk in a prescribed order. First came the braggerful, or chieftain's toast, dedicated to the gods and to the memory of great ancestors. The new heir would make this toast while sitting on the step before the high seat that had belonged to the deceased, but which he had not yet claimed. After making this formal toast, the heir would rise and take his place in the high seat, symbolically assuming the position and authority of the dead person. This public transition of power helped prevent uncertainty or conflict over inheritance, making clear to all present who now held authority in the household or community. Additional toasts might follow to Odin for victory, to Njord and Freyr for peace and good harvests, to Thor for strength. Each toast reaffirmed the community's connections to the divine forces that governed their world, while simultaneously honoring the deceased who had now joined the ranks of ancestors worthy of remembrance. As the feast continued, stories would be told about the dead person, their accomplishments, memorable deeds, notable character traits. These narratives served to comfort the mourners by keeping the memory of the deceased alive in communal consciousness. They also provided models of behavior for the living, especially for younger members of the community who were still forming their identities and values. Music likely accompanied these gatherings, though we have limited knowledge of Viking Age musical practices. The lyres found in some burials, like the fragments from the Sutton who ship burial Anglo-Saxon rather than Vikings, but from a related cultural tradition, suggest that string instruments provided accompaniment for poetry and songs. Drums, flutes, and vocal performances may have been part of these memorial gatherings as well. Poetry held special significance in Norse culture, particularly for commemorating the dead. Skilled poets, called skalds, composed and performed memorial verses that celebrated the deceased's virtues and accomplishments. These complex compositions, with their intricate patterns of alliteration and internal rhyme, were designed to be memorable, ensuring that the names and deeds of the honored dead would be preserved through oral transmission. Some of these memorial poems, like Egil Skallagrim's Sons, sonatoric, irreparable loss of sons, composed after the drowning of his son Bodvar, survive in later written sources. They provide glimpses of personal grief transformed into art, raw emotion channeled through formal poetic structures into expressions that could be shared with and understood by the community. The funeral feast might continue for several days, especially for high-status individuals. Some sources suggest that the Arvel was traditionally held 7 days after the death, though this timing likely varied by region and circumstance. The extended nature of these gatherings allowed for participants to travel from distant areas, ensuring that all who wished to honor the deceased could attend beyond the immediate funeral period. Viking communities created more permanent memorials to their dead. The burial mounds themselves served this purpose, visible markers on the landscape that preserved the memory of the deceased and proclaimed their continuing presence in communal consciousness. But perhaps the most distinctive Viking memorial practice was the creation of runes. These large stones, inscribed with runic text and often decorated with intricate designs, were erected not at burial sites, but in public locations where they would be seen by travelers at crossroads, assembly places, bridges, or along well-traveled paths. The majority of surviving runestones date from the late Viking Age, particularly from the 11th century in Sweden, when Christian influence was beginning to affect Norse burial practices. They represent a fascinating transitional period, often combining traditional Norse artistic elements with Christian symbols and referencing both pagan and Christian concepts of the afterlife. The inscriptions typically follow a formula. Person A raised this stone in memory of person B, his, her relationship. Additional information might include praise for the deceased's character, mention of their accomplishments, or the circumstances of their death. Some stones commemorate those who died far from home in trading journeys to the east, raids in England, or expeditions to distant lands. The Kula runestone in Sweden, for example, bears this inscription. Ulrich raised the stone in memory of Sibi, his father, who was the fairest in Svithjod, Sweden. This simple statement preserves not only Sibi's name, but the relationship between father and son, and the community's high regard for the deceased. Other runestones contain more elaborate texts. The Hillerstja stone records a complex inheritance situation involving multiple deaths, serving as both memorial and legal document. The Rack runestone contains an extensive text of over 700 characters, including both straightforward memorial information and cryptic passages that continue to puzzle scholars. The stones themselves would have been significant undertakings. Suitable boulders had to be selected, sometimes transported to the desired location and prepared for carving. Skilled craftspeople planned and executed the designs and inscriptions, using chisels to create the deep grooves that would withstand weathering. The completed stones were often painted in bright colors, red, black, white, to make the designs and text more visible. Though little of this pigmentation survives today, these runstones served multiple purposes. They honored the dead and ensured their continued remembrance. They proclaimed the status and piety of those who commissioned them. They marked territory and established continuity of ownership or authority. And they communicated messages to the wider community about values, relationships, and notable events. As Christianity gained influence in Scandinavia, memorial practices gradually changed. Church burial replaced mound burial or cremation. Grave goods became simpler or disappeared entirely. Yet elements of the older traditions persisted. Funeral feasts continued, though with Christian prayers replacing pagan toasts and memorial. Stones evolved from runestones to Christian gravestones with crosses and Latin inscriptions. Even today, echoes of these ancient memorial practices can be found in Scandinavian funeral traditions. The gathering of community, the sharing of food and drink, the telling of stories about the deceased. These elements continue to provide comfort and mark the transition between life and death, just as they did for the Vikings over 1,000 years ago. As we reflect on these farewell feasts and memorial stones, we might consider how they addressed universal human needs in the face of death. The need to gather in shared grief, to honor the dead through words and material gestures, to re-establish social order after the disruption of loss, and to create enduring markers that preserve memory across generations. In the soft hours before dawn, as our thoughts drift between wakefulness and dreams, we might imagine those ancient funeral feasts, the firelight illuminating solemn faces, the sound of poetry honoring the departed, the taste of mead drunk in remembrance. We might picture runestones standing sentinel along old pathways, their messages preserved in stone for a millennium, connecting us to individuals whose names might otherwise have been lost to time. Sibi, the fairest in Sweden, Ulrich, the son who honored his father's memory, and countless others whose lives and deaths were commemorated in these enduring monuments. As our journey through Viking burial traditions continues, we come to a period of profound transition, the gradual adoption of Christianity throughout the Norse world and the resulting transformation of burial practices. This change did not happen suddenly or uniformly, but unfolded over approximately 2 centuries, creating a fascinating archaeological record of cultural negotiation and spiritual evolution. Picture a coastal landscape in Scandinavia around the year 900 CE. The physical geography remains as it has been for centuries: fords cutting deep into forested hills, rivers flowing to the sea, settlements nestled in valleys or along protected harbors. But a new cultural influence has begun to reach these shores, carried by missionaries, returning travelers, and political alliances. The Christian faith, already dominant in much of Europe, is making inroads into the Norse Heartlands. The conversion of Scandinavia to Christianity was a complex process influenced by many factors. Political considerations played a significant role as Norse rulers recognized the advantages of aligning themselves with Christian kingdoms. King Harald Bluetooth of Denmark, who claimed to have made the Danes Christian around 965 CE, likely saw Christianity as a unifying force that could strengthen central authority. Similar motivations influenced other Scandinavian rulers. Trade connections exposed Norse merchants to Christian practices and beliefs. Those who traveled to the British Isles, Francia, or beyond encountered Christian communities and sometimes returned with new religious ideas. In some cases, Viking raiders, who settled in already Christianized areas, like Normandy or parts of England, adopted the local faith and eventually brought these beliefs back to their homelands. Missionaries, both formal and informal, actively spread Christian teachings throughout the Norse world. Ansgar, known as the Apostle of the North, made several journeys to Denmark and Sweden in the 9th century. Later missions built on his efforts, gradually establishing churches and Christian communities in traditionally pagan areas. This religious transformation is particularly visible in burial practices, which reflect changing beliefs about death, the afterlife, and proper treatment of the dead. Traditional Norse burials, as we have explored in earlier stories, included cremation or inhumation with grave goods, burial mounds, and sometimes ship burials or stone ship settings. These practices reflected belief in an afterlife where material possessions would be needed and where status distinctions continued. Christian burial customs differed significantly. The body was to be buried intact, not cremated, and laid east-west with the head at the west end, facing east toward Jerusalem. Grave goods were discouraged as unnecessary for the Christian afterlife. Burial location shifted from family plots or mounds to consecrated churchyards, and Christian symbols like crosses replaced traditional Norse motifs in grave markers. The archaeological record shows that these changes did not happen overnight. Instead, we find evidence of hybrid practices burials that incorporate elements of both traditions, suggesting individuals or communities navigating between old beliefs and new faith. Imagine a family in this transitional period, dealing with the death of a beloved elder. Perhaps some younger family members have accepted Christian teachings while others maintain traditional beliefs. How do they honor their dead in a way that respects both perspectives? The compromise might be a burial that positions the body east in Christian fashion, but includes some modest grave goods in the Norse tradition. Or perhaps a small cross is placed alongside traditional amulets like Thor's hammer. Archaeologists have found exactly such hybrid burials throughout Scandinavia. At Birka, in Sweden, graves have been discovered with bodies positioned in a Christian manner, but accompanied by traditional Norse grave goods. In Denmark, burials from the transitional period sometimes contain both pagan amulets and Christian crosses, suggesting individuals hedging their spiritual bets, or families honoring diverse beliefs among their members. The practice of ship burial, so central to high-status Norse funerals, gradually disappeared as Christianity took hold. The last known ship burials in Scandinavia proper date to the late 10th century. The magnificent ship burial at Lodby in Denmark, dating to around 925 CE, represents one of the final expressions of this tradition in the Norse heartlands. Cremation, which had been common in many parts of the Viking world, especially in the earlier Viking Age, similarly declined under Christian influence. The Church opposed cremation, viewing it as a pagan custom contrary to the doctrine of bodily resurrection. Over time, inhumation became the universal practice, though the specific arrangements of Christian burial in coffins, wrapped in shrouds, positioned east-west took longer to become standardized. Grave goods diminished gradually, rather than disappearing instantly. Even after official conversion, many Norse Christians continued to include some personal items with their dead, though in reduced numbers compared to earlier pagan burials. These might be limited to jewelry actually worn by the deceased, or small personal items, rather than the extensive provisions found in pre-Christian graves. The location of burial shifted significantly during this transitional period. Traditional Norse burials might be placed in family plots, in or near burial mounds of ancestors, or in community cemeteries not connected to religious buildings. Christian practice, however, emphasized burial in consecrated ground, typically churchyards, surrounding the new wooden churches being built throughout Scandinavia. This change in burial location had profound social implications. While traditional Norse burial locations often emphasized family connections or community belonging, Christian churchyard burial organized the dead primarily by religious identity. The community of the dead became the community of believers rather than the community of kin or local inhabitants. The physical markers of burial also transformed during this period. Traditional Norse grave markers included burial mounds, stone settings, sometimes in ship shapes, and runestones. Christian graves might be marked with simple wooden crosses initially, evolving to stone crosses or grave slabs as resources permitted. The elaborate pictorial and textual elements of rune stones gradually gave way to simpler Christian inscriptions, asking prayers for the soul of the deceased. Yet even as these changes occurred, elements of continuity persisted. Runestones from the late Viking Age often show fascinating combinations of Christian and Norse imagery. The Jelling stones in Denmark, raised by Harald Bluetooth to commemorate his parents and his own conversion, feature both a depiction of Christ and intertwined animal designs in traditional Norse style. This visual hybridity mirrors the cultural blending that characterized the conversion period. Memorial feasts continued through the transitional period and beyond, though their character changed. Christian prayers replaced pagan toasts. Theological understanding of what these gatherings accomplished for the dead shifted, rather than providing for the deceased's needs in a material afterlife. Christian memorial meals were associated with prayers for the soul's salvation. The rate and nature of these changes varied significantly by region. Denmark, with its proximity to Christian Europe and centralized royal authority, converted relatively early and thoroughly. Sweden, particularly its northern regions, maintained pagan traditions longer. Norway experienced a more contested conversion, with periods of Christian rule followed by pagan reaction before Christianity finally became firmly established under Kings Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson, later Saint Olaf. Around the turn of the 11th century, Iceland's conversion followed a unique path. After debate at the Althing National Assembly in 1000 CE, a compromise was reached whereby the country would officially adopt Christianity while allowing certain pagan practices to continue in private. This pragmatic approach characterizes much of the Norse conversion experience, gradual transition rather than an abrupt replacement, with room for individual and regional variation in how the new faith was integrated with existing cultural frameworks. By approximately 1100 CE, Christianity had become the dominant religion throughout Scandinavia, and burial practices had largely conformed to Christian norms. The elaborate ship burials, the cremation pyres, the extensive grave goods, these had faded into memory, preserved in oral tradition, and, eventually, written sources like the sagas. Yet, the Norse approach to death and burial left lasting imprints on Scandinavian Christianity. Local saints, often converted kings or nobles, became focuses of devotion. Church art incorporated stylistic elements from Norse tradition, and a certain pragmatism in religious matters, a willingness to adapt doctrine to practical realities, characterized Scandinavian Christianity into the modern era. As we contemplate this period of profound cultural transformation, we might reflect on how it represents a universal human experience, the negotiation between tradition and innovation, between inherited wisdom and new insights. The archaeological evidence of hybrid burial practices reminds us that religious change is rarely absolute or immediate, but unfolds through countless individual choices made by families and communities, seeking to honor both their ancestral traditions and their evolving beliefs. In the quiet hours of night, as sleep begins to settle upon us, we might imagine those ancient Scandinavians navigating these Changitsa, grandmother insisting on certain traditional funeral elements despite her Christian grandchildren's reservations. A converted chieftain explaining to his followers why burial practices must change. A stone carver adapting his art to incorporate the cross alongside familiar Norse motifs in their efforts to reconcile old and new, to honor both the past and the future. We recognize our shared humanity across the centuries, our common quest to make meaning of death and what lies beyond. As we drift deeper into our exploration of Viking burial customs, let us turn our attention to the objects that accompanied the Norse dead on their journey to the afterlife, the grave goods that have survived the centuries to tell us stories about both the practical aspects of Viking life and the beliefs that gave meaning to death. Imagine standing at the edge of an open Viking grave, watching as family members carefully place objects around the body of their deceased loved one. Each item represents not just material value, but emotional and symbolic significance. Tools that had extended the person's capabilities in life, weapons that had protected them, jewelry that had adorned them, vessels that had sustained them with food and drink. These objects were not randomly selected but chosen with care, reflecting the identity of the deceased and beliefs about what awaited them beyond death. The most common grave goods found in Viking burials are personal items, objects that would have been used by or associated with the deceased during their lifetime. Combs made of antler or bone, often decorated with intricate carving, appear frequently in both men's and women's graves. These practical tools for grooming suggest concern for appearance even in the afterlife. Similarly, small knives for everyday use, whetstones for sharpening blades, and fire-starting kits of flint and steel ensured the dead could meet basic needs in whatever realm awaited them. Clothing and personal adornment feature prominently among grave goods. While textile fragments rarely survive except in extraordinary preservation conditions, metal accessories that secured or decorated clothing remain. Brooches that fastened women's apron dresses at the shoulders, belt buckles that cinched tunics at the waist, arm rings, finger rings, and neck rings that displayed wealth and status. These items tell us not only about Viking fashion, but about craft specialization, trade networks, and social hierarchies. For men of status, weapons constituted important grave goods. Swords, the most prestigious weapons, required significant resources to produce and were often beautifully decorated with pattern-welded blades and hilts. Spears, more common than swords, served as both hunting tools and weapons of war. Axes, valued for their versatility as both tools and weapons, appear in many male burials. Shield bosses, the metal centerpieces of wooden shields that have long since decayed, mark the graves of warriors. These martial items reflect not just practical fighting equipment, but symbols of masculine identity and social standing. Women's graves often contain items related to textile production: spindle whorls for spinning thread, weaving tablets for creating decorative bands, needles for sewing, and scissors for cutting fabric. These tools represented not mundane household chores, but highly skilled work essential to the Norse economy and social system. Textiles were valuable commodities, and the women who created them held significant economic power. Including these tools in burials acknowledged this important aspect of female identity and contribution. Both men's and women's graves might contain gaming pieces, carved figures of bones, antler, or amber, used for board games like Hnefatafl, a strategic game, sometimes called Viking chess. These leisure items suggest that the afterlife was imagined to include time for recreation and social interaction, not just work or warfare. They also demonstrate the value placed on strategic thinking and social bonding through play. Vessels for food and drink appear in many burials: pottery or soapstone containers, wooden bowls and cups, the latter rarely surviving except in waterlogged conditions, and occasionally glass beakers or metal vessels that represented luxury imports. These containers ensured the dead would not hunger or thirst in the afterlife, a concern common to many cultures throughout history. Tools specific to particular crafts or professions mark the graves of specialists, blacksmiths, hammers and tongs, woodworkers, planes and chisels, traders, scales and weights. These items identified the deceased by their skills and contributions to the community, suggesting that social roles continued beyond death into whatever afterlife realm awaited. For those of highest status, more elaborate and exotic grave goods demonstrated wealth, far-reaching connections, and exceptional social position. The Oseberg ship burial, as we've discussed, contained unique items like ornately carved sleighs and a wagon, elaborate tapestries, and finely crafted wooden objects. The presence of a peacock among the sacrificed animals suggests connections to distant lands, as this bird is not native to Scandinavia. Other high-status burials contained imported luxury goods, silk from Byzantium or the Islamic world, glass vessels from the Rhineland, silver coins from as far away as Baghdad or some distant cultures. Animals were sometimes included as grave goods, their remains found alongside human burials. Horses appear frequently in high-status graves, reflecting their importance as symbols of wealth and mobility. Dogs, loyal companions in life, might accompany their masters in death. Birds of prey, like hawks or falcons, used for hunting, occasionally appear in graves of the elite, though these are more difficult to identify archaeologically as they decompose readily. Animal bones found in graves may represent food provisions rather than sacrifices. Residue analysis of vessels sometimes reveals traces of foods or beverages they once contained: mead, ale, porridge, stew, or other nourishment for the deceased's journey. Amulets and religious or magical items appear in many burials, as discussed in our earlier exploration of protective symbols. Thor's hammer pendants, miniature representations of weapons or tools, unusual stones, or fossils with perceived special properties. These objects provided spiritual protection and connection to divine forces in the vulnerable transition between life and death. The distribution of grave goods was not random, but followed patterns related to age, gender, social status, and regional traditions. Children's graves often contained toys or miniature versions of adult tools, acknowledging their interrupted development toward adult roles. Women's and men's graves typically included gender-associated items, though exceptions exist that challenge our assumptions about strict gender divisions in Norse society. The quantity and quality of grave goods generally corresponded to social status, with elite burials containing more numerous and valuable objects than those of ordinary people. Regional variations in grave goods reflected both cultural differences across the Viking world and changes over time. Early Viking Age burials tend to be richer in grave goods than later ones, partly due to the gradual influence of Christianity with its different attitudes toward burial practices. Norwegian burials often differ from Swedish or Danish ones in specific traditions and objects included, demonstrating that Viking culture was not monolithic but varied across geography and time. What do these grave goods tell us about Norse beliefs regarding death and the afterlife? The provision of practical items suggests belief in an afterlife where everyday activities continued: eating, drinking, crafting, fighting, The inclusion of status markers indicates an expectation that social hierarchies persisted beyond death. The presence of protective amulets reveals concern about spiritual dangers during the soul's journey. Yet, we should be cautious about interpreting grave goods too literally. They reflect not only practical provisions for the dead, but symbolic statements made by the living. A sword in a grave might represent the actual weapon used by a warrior, a symbolic claim to warrior status, regardless of actual fighting experience, or a gift from mourners acknowledging the deceased's social position. Grave goods spoke to the community of mourners as much as they served the dead, making visible statements about identity, relationships, and belonging. As Christianity gradually replaced Norse religious beliefs, the practice of including grave goods diminished. Christian theology discouraged such provisions as unnecessary for salvation, which depended on divine grace rather than material possessions. The transition was gradual, however, with early Christian burials often containing modest grave goods, perhaps a single piece of jewelry or a personal item representing a compromise between old customs and new beliefs. Today, these ancient grave goods reside in museum collections throughout Scandinavia and beyond, carefully preserved and studied by archaeologists seeking to understand Viking Age society. From elaborately decorated swords to humble bone combs, from exotic imported glass to locally crafted pottery, each object offers a glimpse into both practical aspects of Norse life and the beliefs that shaped their understanding of death. As our thoughts drift toward sleep, we might imagine these objects as they were when the gleam of polished metal, the rich colors of textiles, the smooth finish of worked wood. We might picture the hands that crafted them, used them, and finally placed them in graves with care and purpose. In these grave goods, preserved through centuries, we find tangible connections to individuals long gone, their skills, their values, their hopes for what awaited beyond the boundary of death.